Hello, my name is Antonella Sorace. I'm a professor of developmental linguistics at the University of Edinburgh in the United Kingdom. And my area of research is bilingualism over the lifespan. I also direct a center called Bilingualism Matters that tries to bring research to people. And I'm going to say something about this later. So, first of all, I would like to clarify the way I'm using the term bilingualism or multilingualism. For me and for us, a bilingual is not a person who knows two languages perfectly from birth. Many people think that a bilingual is not a bilingual unless they know two languages or more languages perfectly from birth. This is not the way I'm going to use the term bilingual. For us, a bilingual is a person who knows two or more languages and uses them on a regular basis, whether they've learned two languages from birth, or whether they've learned one language first and then another as children, or whether they've learned another language as a young adult or as an older adult. So for us, all these people are multilingual, bilingual or multilingual. So bilingual means more than one. I think it's useful to have an idea of the challenges in a world that is largely dominated by English. So an English dominant world, not only because there are many countries where English is the national language or the native language of the majority of people, or countries where English is the official language, but not the language of the majority of people. There are many countries like that. But English happens to be by far the most commonly studied foreign language in the world. So of the approximately 7.5 billion people living in the world, 1.5 billion speak English. So that's 20% of the Earth population. So English is by far the most commonly studied foreign language in the world. In Europe, is followed by French as a distant second. And that creates, in some countries, what I would call privileged monolingualism. So the country where I live, the UK, is an example. And this is a problem. The privileged monolingualism of a country where English is the natural language has a range of problems. In the UK, which has the worst language skills of all the 28 countries in the European Union, it has been calculated that the lack of language skills costs the economy about 48 billion pounds a year. So that's for the privilege of speaking English and not really learning other languages. So I'm going to tell you why having more than one language is better than having just one language. So what are the benefits of being bilingual, and why is it important to know this? It's interesting to notice, first of all, that views on bilingualism have changed dramatically over the last 100 years. So if you go back to approximately 100 years ago, the Journal of Experimental Psychology, for example, said that the use of a foreign language in the home is one of the chief factors in producing mental retardation. And in 1941, another prominent journal said that the simultaneous learning of two languages produces a mental obfuscation or tangling, which impedes the learning of other subjects. So this wasn't a very long time ago. And it's interesting that these negative views were dominant then. Now we'll see that the views are a lot more positive, but we need, on the one hand, we need to separate myths that still exist, as we'll see, from facts that are emerging from research. But increasingly, we also need to separate science from science fiction. So misinterpretations of research due to poor understanding of what research is actually showing. So what are these myths that still exist? I'm going to show you a few myths about child language learning, first of all, so child bilingualism, And then some myths about adult language learning. For children, it's still widespread, the conviction that learning more than one language from early on, from the very beginning, causes confusion. So a bilingual child is confused. A bilingual child doesn't learn to speak any language properly. We still hear this opinion, it's still quite widespread. And related to that, the idea that if a child has another language, is going to have problems at school. So children, for example, who come from a different language background, whose family speaks another language, how can those children do well if the school language, the language of schooling is English, for example? So problems are predicted. And then the idea that there are useful languages and not so useful languages. So what makes a language useful? Some languages are regarded as instrumentally useful because they are spoken by many people around the world, or they are associated with economic and political power. So English has already been mentioned. Chinese is a language on the rise. Spanish is very widespread. So those are still regarded as very useful languages, worth learning. But other languages are not so useful. So minority languages, indigenous languages, languages only spoken in certain areas, or languages introduced by migration, which is a reality everywhere, more and more of a reality everywhere in the world. And those languages may be spoken by many people in the countries where they're spoken, but they're not regarded as very worthwhile or worth maintaining in the countries where people emigrate. What about adult language learning? Well, one of the most widespread misconceptions is that you can only learn a language well if you're a child. If you're an adult, you can't really learn a language completely. So you can't learn a language well as an adult. And if you start learning a language as an adult, how can you learn best? The widespread idea is that you learn through teaching and correction. So that's the only way to learn. You go to a foreign language classroom where there is a teacher who explains the rules of the grammar of the foreign language you're learning. That is the only way you can learn. And then, of course, if you're an adult, you have at least one language, your native language, although you may have more than one. And so it's predicted that the first language is going to affect the second language that you're learning. So the first language, you make mistakes that are due to transfer from the first language, but there are no effects from the second language to on the first, the native language. Now, what does research says? What are the beneficial effects of being bilingual? Remember, in a broad sense, as I said before, there is one obvious effect that I like to put first, and that is cultural awareness. Behind every language, there is a culture. Let's remember that. So being bilingual is often associated with cultural awareness, being aware of the cultural diversity, not only of the linguistic diversity, but the cultural awareness, cultural diversity in the world. And that can only be a good thing in the kind of society that we live in. But what about the less obvious effects? For one thing, language learning actually changes the brain. And it changes the brain regardless how old you are when you learn another language. So in what way does language learning change the brain? It changes the brain from an anatomical point of view. So it causes a growth of cortical matter, for example, in certain particular areas of the brain. But it also changes the brain from the point of view of connectivity. So connections among and within certain areas of the brain get strengthened by language learning. And this is clearly not a very obvious effect. This actually shouldn't be too surprising because, after all, learning another language or being bilingual, in the broad sense that we talked about before, is a kind of experience. And there are other types of experiences that have been shown to bring about brain changes. For example, there was a famous study on London taxi drivers in a few years ago that showed that taxi drivers, London taxi drivers, have anatomical changes and connectivity changes in the brain for spatial awareness. So they have a better sense of spatial orientation, and their brain reflects that. Not surprisingly, because if you drive a taxi in a city like London, you obviously develop a very good spatial sense of orientation. And musical training is another type of experience that has been shown to change the brain in particular ways. So we're not saying that bilingualism and language learning is a magical kind of experience. It's like other experiences. It's an experience that can cause changes in the brain. But what we really want to know is not so much of whether bilingualism and language learning can change the brain, but whether these experiences can actually change behavior as well. So do these experiences change the way we think or the way we behave? And the short answer is yes, bilingualism and language learning can change behavior. In what way? I'll start by showing some results about children. So in children, it has been shown by research that growing up with more than one language leads to a better understanding of how language works in general. And what I mean by how language works is not knowledge of grammar, because a very young child doesn't know what to do with knowledge of grammar the way an adult understands the term. I'm talking about implicit, spontaneous, tacit knowledge of how language works in general. And that leads to a better ability to understand and learn other languages. It can lead to a head start in early literacy. So learning to read certain aspects of early literacy, particularly with respect to learning to read, can be favored by the presence of more than one language. And as I said, a better ability to learn other languages. So starting from two languages, learning a third language or learning a fourth language is easier than starting from one. And also, this language awareness leads to potentially better ability to understand the majority language. So the language of schooling, if a child learns enough of the majority language, then their being bilingual or multilingual can help them to understand how the language of schooling works in a better way. When a bilingual child mixes their languages, and this is something that worries many parents and teachers, language mixing is not usually a sign of confusion, but actually language mixing indicates good competence in both languages. So language mixing follows a grammar. Language mixing follows rules, implicit rules. So it's not just a random behavior, but it follows particular rules that children are very sensitive to from early on. And these rules are the same rules followed by adults in communities where language mixing and language switching is a common behavior. That example, if you're wondering, is an example from one of my sons who grew up bilingual in Italian, which is my native language, and English, my husband's language. And that sentence means, "Mommy, are we going to have crunchy potatoes tonight, roasted potatoes?" What is funny about that sentence is the word cruncioso, because cruncioso doesn't exist in Italian. It's clearly made up on the basis of the English word crunchy. But that sentence is perfect from the point of view of pronunciation, from the point of view of grammar. It's the correct word order in Italian. So that sentence shows very good knowledge of Italian, even if it's an example of language mixing. Now, what about other effects on behavior that research has shown on in both children and adults? An important one is that bilingualism, having more than one language in the brain, can lead to a better awareness of other people's perspectives, a better understanding that it is possible to have a different point of view, and a better ability to understand what the other person's point of view might be. And this comes from the experience of having, for example, two words for the same object, but also from the experience of having to choose the right language depending on who you're talking to. So bilingual children realize very early on that not everybody is bilingual. And so they have to choose the right language depending on who they are talking to. And that means understanding, putting themselves into the other person's position and understanding their linguistic perspective. And this early experience is generalized to a better awareness of other perspectives in general. And that is very important, again, in today's society, to have this kind of mental flexibility towards other people's points of view. But there is also another effect on mental flexibility, and that has an effect, is an effect on attention, how we control attention, which is something we have to do all the time. We have to pay attention to what we are doing, otherwise we don't do it well. We have to pay attention to what matters for the task at hand, and we have to try not to be distracted by other factors that might divert our attention away from what matters. This is what is meant by selective or focused attention, and this is what has been found to be potentially better in bilinguals. And this is also related to the ability to handle conflicting information and the ability to switch from one task to the other. What's the origin of these benefits? The origin is the experience of switching from one language to the other. But not only that, the experience of having to exclude or inhibit the languages that we're not using. So when we speak one language, we have to exclude the other language or languages that we know, because all languages are always active in the bilingual brain. We can't switch off a language because we don't need it today. So when we speak one, we have to actively exclude the others. And so that leads to a better ability to exclude or inhibit extraneous information, irrelevant information, not only in language control, but also in controlling attention in general. Again, this is a very, very useful ability that plays a role in every aspect of our everyday life. For adults, what does research actually show? Research shows that adults can learn a second language very well indeed, even if they grew up with only one language, and even if they start learning a language later in life, for example, in their university studies. So it is possible to learn, to reach very high levels, even native-like levels of proficiency. In Edinburgh, we study these very proficient, very capable learners. They're not Martians. They have a brain like yours and mine. And they show that it is possible to reach those levels. Obviously, certain conditions have to be met. There has to be enough time to devote to the second language. Let's remember that many adults have many responsibilities, unlike young children who can be fully immersed in the language. Adults may have jobs and families and other things to do in their everyday life, and so less time and less dedication to a foreign language. Nevertheless, it is possible to reach very high levels. And learning another language actually shows very good brain plasticity that is found not only young adults, but also in older adults. This is probably one of the main results of research on the brain, not just for bilingualism, but in general, in the last 50 years. There is a lot more brain plasticity than we thought until fairly recently. And that brain plasticity is not found only in children, but it can be found in older adults later in life, over the lifespan. And it has been found that multilingualism can act as a kind of cognitive reserve that can delay certain aspects of aging. That means normal aging, so the normal loss of certain aspects of cognition, like memory or attention. In all people, these kinds of abilities may gradually decline, but very gradually, into the extent that people are not even aware that this is happening, and people can compensate these losses with many other kinds of experiences. Bilingualism is one of the experiences that have been shown to have the potential to compensate for normal decline in aging. And for certain kinds of pathological decline, so certain kinds of dementia, it has been found that bilingualism may slow down, delay the appearance of the first unambiguous symptoms of the disease. So by 4 or 5 years, it has been found that not in all bilinguals, but in many bilinguals, the appearance of the unambiguous symptoms of certain kinds of dementia can be delayed. Now, I mentioned new myths and science fiction at the beginning, and we see that in addition to the old myths that are still there are some new myths that are arising out of the misunderstanding of research. So, for example, the claim that bilingualism makes children more intelligent. You can turn your child into a genius if you follow this method, and if you give them more than one language. Actually, we're not talking about intelligence. We're not saying that bilingual children are more intelligent. We're saying that bilingual children can have an extra gear that gives them an advantage in certain situations of everyday life, and so it's an investment for the future. But we are not saying that bilingual children become more intelligent. And similarly, at the opposite end of the lifespan, the claim that if you're bilingual, you don't get Alzheimer's or you don't get dementia. Nobody actually says that. What research is showing, as I said just now, is a delay in the appearance of the first symptoms. So if someone, unfortunately, gets one of these kinds of dementia, bilingualism is completely unrelated to that, but it can act as a potential compensating factor that might delay the appearance of the first symptoms and give people maybe 4 or 5 years of independence and autonomy. Now, the most important point that I want to point out at the moment, based on what I've just said, is that it doesn't matter which languages the bilingual knows. So what matters from the linguistic and the cognitive point of view is the fact of having more than one language in the brain. There are no useful or useless languages or less useful languages from this point of view. So remember, some people think that only some languages are worth learning because those are the languages that open bridges and open, they're good for employment because they are instrumentally useful. Actually, from this point of view, it's the presence of more than one language in the brain and the constant mental gymnastics that goes together with having more than one language in the brain that gives these potential advantages. Do you need to be perfect? Do you need to be perfectly bilingual or multilingual in order to see these benefits? No, you don't need to speak like a native because the perfect bilingual doesn't exist. All bilinguals have a language that is temporarily dominant depending on where they are, who they're speaking to, what they're talking about. And then if the situation changes, it might be that the other language or languages take over. So unbalanced bilingualism is much more common. In fact, is the norm. And so the idea that you need to speak like a native, you need to be perfect in both languages is wrong. Are these benefits always found in all bilinguals? And the answer is no. These benefits are not always found because bilingualism is not a black or white dimension. It's a continuous dimension. It comes in many shapes and colors, and many other factors play a role in bilingualism. And let's remember that, I mentioned many benefits, but there are many challenges too. I'll come back to this. But these challenges can be addressed if they are known and better understood. So there are very important implications for society. There are implications for families. There are implications for language learning and teaching in schools, implications for migrant children, migrant families, and multilingual classrooms, implications for regional or indigenous minority languages, implications for policymakers that make language policies, implications for the private sector and businesses. I'm going to say something very briefly about each of these sectors. For early bilingualism, what matters? What is it that a child needs in order to have these benefits? Because as we said, these benefits are not always found. It's interesting that very, very few studies found the disadvantage of bilingualism, but there are studies that don't find any advantage of bilingualism. In other words, no differences between bilinguals and monolinguals. So what does a bilingual child need? A bilingual child needs enough engaging exposure to both languages. So it's not enough to have, for example, parents who speak two different languages if the child doesn't have the opportunity to hear both languages and in an engaging way. Because remember, a young child doesn't need language lessons, but they need to be engaged with languages. They need to be motivated to speak and hear these languages. Also, they need to hear and get the language from a variety of speakers. This is important. So hearing the language from one speaker, that helps, but it doesn't help as much as having maybe a community around or even a limited community, so more than one speaker who naturally speak in different ways because nobody speaks in exactly the same way. And it has been found in research that exposure to variation, normal variation, actually helps language acquisition, language development. So having a community in both languages is very important for bilingual children. Literacy also helps, and biliteracy is not very common, but when it exists, it actually, research shows that being literate in both languages actually helps, partly because it gives children access to a wider variety of sources of input, particularly in the minority language, which is not the language of schooling, for example. So access to books, access to reading materials, that is very, very important. And positive attitudes matter. So it's important that children have a positive attitude towards their being bilingual and towards their being bilingual in particular languages. Children are very sensitive to what people think about their languages, and being surrounded by supporting people and a supporting environment is very positive. Language learning at school, this is very important. And in countries like the UK, where the interest in languages is not so widespread as in other countries, it's important to have the right kind of setting at school for language learning. Now, one thing that many people think is that, well, children's brain is like a sponge, right? So if you have a child in a classroom and you expose them to a language, well, their brain just sucks it in, and it magically absorbs it. Is this the way it works? Well, actually, research shows that younger doesn't necessarily mean better than older, as we saw before, unless there is enough input in the second language. We saw this before. A child needs enough exposure to a second language, unless there is enough engagement with the second language, even in a school environment. So a boring lesson at school doesn't really help from the point of view of language learning. A variety of speaker, as I said, so not just one teacher, but possibly other people who speak the language and model the language to the child. And a question that is often asked is whether there are difficult languages from the point of view of a child. And what we can say at this stage is that all languages are learnable by young children, but children don't learn like adults. And children learn they learn in different ways depending on how old they are. So they rely on different cognitive mechanisms as they develop, because the brain of a 5-year-old is not the same as the brain of a 10-year-old. And so language learning in schools should take this into account, because teachers should have realistic expectations about learning outcomes depending on all these factors, all these variables. So very often for language learning at schools, we have to distinguish, we have to separate dreams, what the school would like to achieve, or what a language policy would like to achieve, from reality. Typically children are exposed to a language 1 hour a week, for example, in Scotland. Is that enough time? Well, probably not. Teachers should be properly trained on what happens in language learning, how children learn at different ages. Parents should also be informed so that they can support their child, so that they can create a supportive environment for their child's language learning efforts in the classroom. When children go back home, they can be actually celebrated by parents in their effort to learn another language. But parents should also know the basics of how languages are learned by children at different ages. What about the implications for migrant families? Migrant families are often under pressure to stop speaking their home languages. And that's partly because they themselves may believe that their home language is an obstacle to learning the community language. And that it might be an obstacle particularly for their children, because these families want their children to be to learn the community language, to socialize in the new environment, and they think that the home language might be a problem. Actually, on the basis of everything that I said up to now, we have to conclude that maintaining the home language is not an obstacle to learning the community language. Obviously, a migrant child has to hear enough of the community language to learn it. But that doesn't have to be at the expense of the home language. They can maintain the home language, at the same time learn another language and get the benefits of being bilingual or multilingual. So maintaining the home language is possible even when the child is learning another language, but it's not very easy for many families. There are challenges for many migrant families due to a variety of situations. So we shouldn't minimize the challenges, but at the same time, we should tell these families that maintaining their language is not only a benefit from the point of view of family communication, because that's obviously easier in the home language, but it's also better from the point of view of their child's language learning and their child's benefits from the point of view of the brain. And there is a tendency in many countries to treat migrant families and migrant children as having a problem. So there is a tendency to problematize or pathologize issues related to migration and second language learning. And that is often due to the certain biases, which we can call monolingual biases or monocultural biases in diagnostic tools that are used in health practices, for example, or in educational settings. Many of the tests that are used in these settings are based on monolingual norms. They're based, for example, on some idea of how many words a 6-year-old is supposed to know if they know only one language, if they're monolingual. A bilingual child may not do very well if they're tested with these instruments. So instruments should be adapted, or new instruments should be created to test bilingual children, taking into account that their vocabulary may be widespread across two languages rather than just in one. And so the monolingual bias means that, again, the bilingual is regarded as two monolinguals in one. So they are expected to behave like a monolingual in language A and a monolingual in language B. And this is not something that we should expect. So there is a lot to be done to reduce or eliminate these monolingual and monocultural biases and regard bilingual children as potentially having resources that monolingual children don't have, and not just problems. And for indigenous minority languages, the problem is that these languages are not regarded as useful, as we said at the beginning. And they're often regarded as interfering with the majority language. So, for example, in Scotland, a child who speaks Gaelic, which is the most supported language, minority language in Scotland, they may be seen as not speaking English very well. And all these languages are under threat because they are seen as competing with English, and they're seen as being an obstacle to learning a more desirable and instrumentally more useful language. So I would like to say something about the benefits of linguistic diversity at this point. And we should be aware that of the approximately 7,000 languages spoken worldwide, there are only 25 languages that account for more than half of the world's population. That means that the vast majority of languages are indeed minority languages in every country in which they're spoken. And it's in our interest to maintain this linguistic diversity, because this linguistic diversity is also cultural diversity, and that really needs to be maintained in human societies. So what can be done to maintain minority languages? Well, we have to make sure that people understand that these languages are a resource. They're not a problem, they are a resource. If there is another language at the doorstep, people should invest in it, and countries should invest in these languages. And in fact, many countries are engaging in revitalization programs, so language policies, interventions that are meant to protect these minority languages. What we find, however, is that very often these well-meaning policies and interventions, they're not very well connected with the communities where these languages are spoken. These may be small communities, but they have to be taken into account. And this connection is essential because it's only through intergenerational transmission, so transmission from one generation to the next, and then to the next, and then to the next, that languages can be maintained. So it's important that language policies do something to maintain this process of intergenerational transmission. And in our experience, this is often not the connection is really not there, or is not strong enough. And we have to cultivate, as we said before, positive attitudes in children and young people, because those positive attitudes are absolutely essential to make sure that these children, when their time comes, are willing to speak their language, their minority language, to their own children. And it's important to keep in mind that all minority languages change. This is absolutely normal. So living languages in contact with other languages change across generations in both directions. So languages in contact affect each other, both in the same brain, in the same individual brain, but also in societies. And what we see very often is that these well-meaning revitalization programs and policies actually look at the way languages were spoken a couple of generations ago. They are looking at maintaining the high standards of the way languages used to be spoken. Well, those languages can't be spoken that way anymore, because it's a natural process of language change that takes place when languages are transmitted from one generation to the other. And that doesn't mean that the language is dying. On the contrary, that transmission ensures that the language is maintained, even if it's not the same as the language that was spoken by our grandparents. And finally, the private sector needs multilinguals. It seems like it should go without saying, but in fact, particularly in the Anglosphere, this is not well understood. So the private sector, businesses need languages not only to trade with a greater number of international partners, understand cultural differences and so on, but also because of the changes, the benefits in the brain that I mentioned before. So languages can bring specific advantages that benefit business skills. For example, negotiating. For example, negotiating, and understanding where the other person's, the counterpart's proposal comes from, because of a better ability to understand the other person's perspective. So that leads to better negotiating abilities, the ability to compromise, the ability to prioritize on many competing demands, and the ability to decide in a rational way. All of these skills can be positively affected by the benefits that I mentioned before. So the private sector needs multilinguals and multilingualism in more than one sense. So what can be done? We think that it's essential that society has the right kind of information in an accessible way. So it's essential to provide accessible information to parents, to learners, to teachers, to policymakers about the benefits, but also about the challenges and about the facts, for example, developmental facts about bilingualism. And having this kind of information can lead to better decisions. It can lead to decisions that are not based on misconceptions, either old or new, but they're based on information. And that's why my center, Bilingualism Matters, exists. I founded Bilingualism Matters 12 years ago. As a local service that attracted a lot of attention and started expanding and organizing seminars and training for many sectors of society, including families, educators, health professionals, policymakers, international companies and institutions. Increasingly, we also talk to children and younger people in the appropriate way, of course, just to make them enthusiastic and joyful about languages and language learning. We provide we do public engagement, policy advice. We are in the media quite a lot. We do research commissioned by stakeholders, and we have a wide network of international branches. At the moment, we have 26 branches or chapters in Europe, in the US, in Canada, in the Middle East, and in China. And we have expressions of interest from, at the moment, 6 more countries with whom we are negotiating to open new chapters and new branches. And having this international network allows us not only to exchange research. None of us is an expert on all aspects of research on multilingualism, but we can exchange research from different areas of competence on bilingualism, but also we can exchange good public engagement practices. So how to talk to people, how to bring research to people in different language environments, in different political contexts, in different social situations. So we go from research to the community. So we are researchers. We try to bring research to the community. We do research because that's what we do for a living. We have many research projects funded by many different research funders in different countries. And we have many different partnerships and collaborations, both with the public sector, so governments, local education authorities, but also increasingly the private sector, increasingly charities that are engaged with society, health companies and operations. And half of our work is actually to say to people that bilingualism doesn't damage children. As we said, there are many people who still think that. And language learning is not a waste of time and money, especially in the Anglosphere, where people think, well, everybody speaks English. Why should we learn other languages? So if we can convince people of these two important messages, we're halfway there. But the other half of our work is to persuade people that bilingualism in any languages may actually be very good for both children and adults. So all languages are worth speaking. All languages are worth maintaining. There are problems, there are challenges in many different situations that can be addressed if they are properly understood. But also, so it's not just that we speak to society from the research point of view. Research learns a lot. We learn a lot from engaging with communities. So it's a full circle. Our research gets more insightful by engaging with society. We have a better understanding of the context for many of our research questions, and we have better research insights. And we train students to assist with our projects. We train students to engage with society, which means, among many other things, to speak clearly, to be able to speak not in jargon, not in words that people don't understand, but we had to adapt our messages to people from many different sectors of society, very different levels of education. And that is a very useful experience that is useful no matter what students end up doing once they finish their degree. And this experience is increasingly valued by employers, and we know this for a fact. So these are the ways to contact us. If anybody wants to contact us or have more information about us, there are different ways of reaching us. And at this point, I would like to thank you very much for listening.